Ecclesiastes chapter 9. We left off about verses 11 and 12. Where Solomon here is talking about how chance happens to people, and also how in verse 12 we don't know our time as far as the time of our death. He says in verse 12, it's like a fish taken in a cruel net, like birds caught in a snare, so the sons of men are snared in an evil time when it falls suddenly upon them. We referenced Hebrews chapter 9 and verse 27, that death is an appointment that we're all going to keep. It's appointed unto men to die once, and after that comes the judgment. So when it is the time of our departure, or the time of our death, it's going to happen. It's something that we don't know. We don't know. Even though you might have someone who's terminally ill, and they have an approximate lifespan, so to speak, as far as a short period of time, within they're given 3 or 4 months sometimes, and they still don't know whether they're going to live or die. Some people who have been given 3 months have lived 30 years. So some people who have been given 3 months die within 3 days. So you don't know. And we always say it's only, when we refer to people who are terminally ill, we say, oh, it's just a matter of time. But you know what? That's true of all of us. It's just a matter of time. I made it to my 33rd birthday this month, and I thought to myself, well, if I die now, they could say he lived to be 33. They at least for sure can say that. But we don't know. We do not know, and so it's wise, as we're looking at this as wisdom literature, we've got to live wisely. We've got to live in harmony with the will of God, so that when death comes, whether it be in the prime of life, so to speak, whether it be as a youth or older or suddenly or slowly, whatever it might be, we're ready. We're always ready. Ecclesiastes 9 and verse 13, he says, "This wisdom I have also seen under the sun." There's that key phrase, under the sun. Here's how I perceive things on earth. "And it seemed great to me. There was a little city with a few men in it. A great king came against it, besieged it, built great snares around it." Verse 15, "Now there was found in it a poor wise man, and he by his wisdom delivered the city. Yet no one remembered the same poor man." So he's kind of giving a little story here, a parable, if you will. And he's saying, here's what I've seen. You have this little city with just a few men in it. And you had this great king come against the city and besieged it, which was normal in that ancient practice. You besiege the city, you cut off its water supply, you cut off its food supply, you don't allow things to go in and out. You basically starve them in submission. That's basically the point of sieging a city. And the only person that could help them get out of that situation was a poor wise man. And he gave some words of wisdom that somehow helped them to escape this great king that was trying to take the city. Yet no one remembered the same poor man. In other words, he doesn't get recognition for it. He doesn't get recognition that his wisdom is what delivered that small city that seemed like it was going to be taken over by this great king. Then he said in verse 16, "Then I said, wisdom is better than strength. Nevertheless, the poor man's wisdom is despised, and his words are not heard." Through his wisdom, this poor man's wisdom, whatever he said, and whatever action was taken as a result of his words, caused that small city that seemed to be just in deep problems, that was not going to get out of those problems, to escape this besieging and this the snare this great king had for this city. And he says wisdom, in verse 16, is better than strength. The small city was weak, so to speak, poor. It was not going to be able to fight against this great king, yet the wisdom of this poor man got them out of the situation. We're not told the details of how that happened, but it helped them get out of the situation to which they survived in a situation that seemed like was going to lead to their destruction. Then he says in verse 16, nevertheless, the poor man's wisdom is despised, and his words are not heard. Again, he is not recognized as the one who saved the city. He doesn't receive that recognition. Verse 17, words of the wise spoken quietly should be heard rather than the shout of a ruler of fools. The words of a wise spoken quietly. That should be listened to than the ruler of fools. Someone who's loud and they're giving advice and they don't know what in the world they're talking about. But you have a quiet, humble individual, poor individual, who has words of wisdom that if you go with those words, that is going to be a wise course of action. Verse 18, wisdom is better than weapons of war. It's better than weapons of war because this poor city, this city was going to be destroyed by this great king, but these words of wisdom helped deliver that small city from this great king. So that means these words were more powerful than weapons. Whatever that wisdom was that helped them get out of that situation is more powerful than those physical weapons that they had because it caused them to be delivered. If they would have went up against that great king with their weapons, they would have been destroyed. But wisdom prevailed and they escaped destruction. But yet Solomon says that poor man's wisdom wasn't recognized. He was not recognized. But God would recognize him. God would see it. God would know. And so it's the concept of someone might have a great statement of wisdom or something smart to say, but they don't get recognition for it. And that's how things prevail on earth. So many great things happen by poor people who have a lot of wisdom. They might not have a lot of education as far as degrees. They have a lot of wisdom. And they say some things, and that wise statement helps a situation out, but that individual does not get recognized. Verse 18, wisdom is better than weapons of war, but one sinner destroys much good. And I believe that goes along with chapter 10 and verse 1. Dead flies putrefy the perfumer's ointment and cause it to give off a foul odor. So does a little folly to one respected for wisdom and honor. So this goes along with chapter 10 and verse 1. One sinner destroys much good. Just like one wise person can do so much good, one sinner can cause so much harm. What do we say in our society? One bad apple spoils the whole bunch. And that's just so true. One person can cause so much trouble. One individual within a congregation can cause so much trouble within the congregation. And one person that's wise in a congregation, who doesn't want recognition, doesn't want to be in the spotlight, yet can say some wise things and help out a congregation that's going through difficulty. Chapter 10 and verse 1, dead flies putrefy the perfumer's ointment. Of course, you get dead flies in the ointment, a perfumer's ointment, that's going to putrefy it, and it causes it to give off a foul odor. They're not very big, creatures, flies are, but they can cause so much trouble. So does a little folly to one respected for wisdom and honor. Someone respected for wisdom and honor, and they get involved in just a little folly, that can ruin their reputation. How many times have we seen that in politics? Someone who's done something in their past, or even when they're in office, that little bit of folly ruins them. Just for a few moments of pleasure, just for a few moments of doing something, maybe dishonest, perhaps pencil whipping the paperwork and not being true to what they're supposed to be doing. And that little bit of folly can cause a person so much trouble who is respected for wisdom and honor. That can be true for a preacher. How many preachers have fallen over a little bit of folly? Just a little bit of folly. You know, a little bit of sin in the eyes of God is what can cause a person to lose their soul. But a little bit of folly have ruined marriages, have ruined the reputation of preachers, have ruined the reputation of congregations. Just a little bit of sin. What did Paul say? A little leaven leaveneth the whole lump. In 1 Corinthians chapter 5. Just a little bit. Verse 2, a wise man's heart is at his right hand, but a fool's heart is at his left. So if you're left-handed, you're a fool. It's not what it's saying. But see how a person could take a passage out of context and make it say something it's not saying? That's called perverting the Scripture. He's basically talking about the right hand and the left. When you understand the importance of the right hand and the left, you see how it's used here in Ecclesiastes 10 and verse 2. Remember in Matthew chapter 5, Jesus talking about those who are going to be saved. They're going to be where? On His right hand. The place of honor. The place of respect. The place of fellowship. Those on His left hand will be cast into the lake of fire, eternal punishment. They're going to be banished from God's presence. So it's talking about wisdom and using wisdom here. A wise man's heart is at his right hand, but a fool's heart at the left. Left representing a course of action that is not in harmony with the will of God. Listening to unwise counsel, in other words. Psalm chapter 1 that we looked at. They're listening to ungodly counsel. The counsel of the ungodly. The left hand, so to speak. But a wise man's heart is at his right hand. They're listening to things that are spiritual. Listening to advice, even though that advice might be offensive to them. They might get upset about it. But it's something they need to hear. And so that is a wise course of action. Verse 3. Yes. That's a good point. On the left. Right. That's a good illustration of how that concept is even in our culture. Person on the left, they're the liberals. The persons on the left, they're the ones that are pro-homosexual. They're pro abortion, things of that nature, and people talk about those who are on the extreme left, things of that nature. And those who are against it are called right-wing radicals, the extreme right. The talk on television and on the news today is the religious parties and those who are into politics say that the right-wing radicals have taken control of this nation. And it's just bothering them so bad that they can't get homosexual marriage legalized. And they're just wringing their hands, so to speak, over how the right wing has just taken over. Out there in left field. That's another good point. I mean, that is how we use right and left. Someone's way out in left field, it's like, they're just kind of out there. So it's one of those things where we use that kind of language in our society. Was it in Jonah? I believe it was in Jonah where you find that God was talking to Jonah about sparing the city of Nineveh. He said there are many people in there in the city who don't know their right hand from their left. He's talking about accountability. There are some innocent people in that city that I'm going to spare, Jonah. They don't know their right hand from their left. And that's just referring to their state of innocence. They're little children. They're babies. infants. So we use that terminology. That's very good. We use that terminology in our society as well. Verse 3, Ecclesiastes 10 and verse 3, even when a fool walks along the way, he lacks wisdom, and he shows everyone that he is a fool. If the spirit of the ruler rises against you, do not leave your post, for conciliation pacifies great offenses. And verse 3 here talks about a fool who walks along the way, lacks wisdom. And if you're watching a fool, he's going to show everyone that he is a fool. It's going to be obvious to everyone. It's usually the people who think they know the most about just about everything. You ever work with someone, if you did something, they've done it 5 times? You know, you went to Colorado for vacation, they went to Nairobi, Kenya. They can always top you, you know. They've done it just a little bit better. Just let them talk. They'll show themselves to be a fool. They're always, it's a lack of confidence. A low self-esteem is what it is in them. They've got to always, be one up on you. Yeah, that goes along with that. It's that attitude, I can do it better, or I have done it better. Well, you went there, well, I went there, So it's that attitude, and you just let them talk, and he's going to talk about later how that the fool has a multitude of words. They'll show themselves to be foolish. It'll be obvious to everyone. Verse 4, the spirit of the ruler rises against you. Do not leave your post, for conciliation pacifies great offenses. So here you don't fear the ruler who rises against you. Don't leave your post. Don't leave where you're posted, in the sense of being like a soldier posted at a certain location. You do not leave in that situation, because conciliation pacifies great offenses. When there is a conciliation, when there is a strong stand by several, it pacifies great offenses. Verse 5, there is an evil I have seen under the sun. There's that phrase again, under the sun. As an error proceeding from the ruler. Folly is set in great dignity, while the rich sit in a lowly place. Verse 7, I have seen servants on horses, while princes walk on the ground like servants. Again, here Solomon is saying, look, here's what I've seen under the sun. Some things are topsy-turvy. You have folly set in great dignity. You have foolish people in great dignity, while the rich sit in a lowly place. They're not in the place of prominence, so to speak. And I have seen servants on horses, while princes walk on the ground like servants. The princes are supposed to be on the horses. The princes are supposed to be in the carriages, and the servants are supposed to be walking. But see, Solomon's saying, I've seen it the other way around. Look at verse 8. He who digs a pit will fall into it. Whoever breaks through a wall will be bitten by a serpent. You ever hear the expression in our society, you dug your own hole? That's basically taken from this concept here. He who digs a pit will fall into it. And you're in the concept here, if you're living foolishly, you're going to fall into your own pit. And there's really no one to blame but yourself. You're the one digging the pit, and you fell into it. Whosoever breaks through a wall will be bitten by a serpent. Serpents would live, or snakes would live, between the walls there in the ancient huts or the ancient walls of buildings back then. And if you break through that, you'd be bitten by a snake, is basically what he's saying. If you break through that wall, you'll be bitten by a serpent. That wall's there for a purpose. Don't be so foolish as to break through it, and if you do, you'll suffer the consequences. Verse 9, he who quarries stones may be hurt by them, and he who splits wood may be endangered by it. So again, he's talking about how that something that you're involved in can hurt you. If you're quarrying stones, you're cutting stones for buildings, you can get hurt by that. And he's also talking here about splitting wood. You can be hurt by doing that as well. The things that you're involved in. In other words, be careful what you're involved in. You can get hurt by it. Look at verse 10. If an axe is dull and one does not sharpen the edge, then he must use more strength. But wisdom brings success. Here's just practical wisdom. Here's where wisdom plays a part in the practicality of success. You have a person who is smart enough to know, okay, to get this tree down, I've got to use an axe. But the wise person says that axe has got to be sharp for me to get that tree down. So there's kind of your difference in wisdom and intelligence. The intelligent person says, I've got to get this tree down, and I've got to get it down with an axe. But wisdom says it's got to be sharp. It's got to be sharp. Right. What's that saying? The haste makes waste. A person who's in a hurry to go out and cut wood is not going to take the time to sharpen their axe. They're just in a hurry and they're just focused on that. The wise person will take the time to sharpen that axe, and at the end of the day, he's going to be more successful. And that's a great point. That you take the time to do things right. And if you don't take that time to do things right and use wisdom, you're not going to be successful. And there's where wisdom comes in to play. Right. Right. It's one of those things where you got to be prepared. You know, in the New Testament it talks about the Word of God being the sword of the Spirit. You've got to be prepared to use that sword. In other words, you've got to understand what's being taught, how they teach it, so that you can go up against it with love and do spiritual battle. And so many people who are not trained as far as knowing what they know a little bit about what the Bible says. They don't really know what the person is they're trying to study with, what they believe or teach, and that they can't get the truth across to them because they don't know why they teach what they teach. They don't know what kind of practices they're involved in. So there's a lot of wisdom that has to go into, like you said, evangelism. We've got to sharpen ourselves up as far as what's going on. Work smarter, not harder. That's it. And that's exactly what verse 10 is saying. You work smarter, and smarter involves wisdom. Because the person who has a dull axe is going to work harder. And that's going to cause him not to be successful. Look at verse 11. A serpent may bite when it is not charmed. The babbler is no different. The babbler there is one who uses their tongue to talk a lot. He's going to talk about the use of the speech here. And he said in verse 12, the words of a wise man's mouth are gracious, but the lips of a fool shall swallow him up. In other words, you're going to say things, and we say this, we're going to put our foot in our mouth. We say certain things foolishly. Swallow ourselves up by our own words. The words of a wise man, the wise mouth, are gracious. Verse 13, the words of his mouth begin with foolishness, and the end of his talk is raving madness. So the fool, he begins with foolishness, and he ends in raving madness. So because he started out in a foolish way, it ends up in an even worse way. Verse 14, a fool also multiplies words. No man knows what it is to be. Who can tell him what will be after him? So in verse 14, a fool multiplies his words. Look at Proverbs chapter 15. Proverbs chapter 15. Verse 2. Proverbs 15 and verse 2. The tongue of the wise uses knowledge rightly, but the mouth of fools pours forth foolishness. A wise person needs to know how to say what is true. I mean, if you go up to someone you're studying with and say, look, if you're not baptized for forgiveness of your sins, you're going to burn in hell. Well, that's a true statement. But there's a wiser way of saying that. You got to use wisdom in approaching a situation like that. And so the fool will just spout out and pour forth foolishness. I've been taught, and I believe it's very correct, that when you're having a Bible study, you always have a partner that's silent. And if you have someone with you that doesn't know when to close their mouth and say nothing, don't use that person as your partner, because they can do more damage than good. You got to have a silent partner there that has the wisdom to not interrupt or interject or say things, and so there's wisdom that's involved there. But a fool is just talking. And so there's just a lot of foolishness that's poured forth from his mouth. Ecclesiastes 10 and verse 14, no man knows what is to be. Who can tell him what will be after him? The labor of fools wearies them, for they do not even know how to go to the city. You don't know what's going to come after you, basically what he's saying. And the labor of the fool wearies him. Why is the fool going to be wearied? Well, for one thing, verse 10, he's going to go out and chop down trees with a dull axe. And that's just not smart. He's going to have to work extra hard in what he's doing. And his foolishness is going to weary him. Whereas if he'd taken the time to use wisdom and sharpen the axe, he's not going to be wearied. And he says in verse 15, for they don't even know how to go to the city. So, I mean, how are you going to trust a fool's advice? They don't even know how to get to the city. So there's a lack of wisdom there in the fool. Look at verse 16. Woe to you, O land, when your king is a child and your princes feast in the morning. The child there in verse 16, I don't think necessarily refers to a child chronologically as much as being immature. Woe to you, O land, when your king is immature, childish, and your princes feast in the morning. They just want to party all the time. And so they want to be involved in these things. Verse 17, blessed are you, O land, when your king is the son of nobles, and your princes feast at the proper time for strength and not for drunkenness. So the wise ruler is someone who had the wise or the blessed land rather is the land that has a king who is the son of nobles. In other words, there's a proper place for certain things, and he understands that. In contrast to the foolish ruler who's childlike and wants to just party all the time. Verse 17, your princes feast at the proper time. They know when there's a time and place for everything, and the strength and not for drunkenness. They're not having a party to get drunk, like the childish king would. Verse 18, because of laziness the building decays, and through idleness of hands the house leaks. A feast is made for laughter, and wine makes merry, but money answers everything. Verse 18, when you have a house that's in decay, and there's someone that's living there that can do something about it, usually that indicates the person who occupies the house is lazy. So, because of laziness, the building decays. Here's a person that isn't involved in fixing the house or fixing something that needs to be fixed. And that is showing how that idleness or laziness can cause problems. Verse 18, and through idleness of hands the house leaks. You put that into the spiritual realm in the New Testament. Idleness, laziness, spiritually speaking. The church, I'm not talking about the building, the church, the people, are going to decay. There's going to be leaks. The house of God is not going to be what it should be if everyone's not working together. If we're content with being idle and lazy, then the church will not be what it should be, and it will fall into decay. That's what happened in the Old Testament. The very temple that Solomon built years later on would fall into decay because the rulers became corrupt and they stopped repairing the temple. King Josiah comes along, finds a part of the law that had been lost, and says, we need to repair this temple. But neglect, they become lazy, they become self-centered. Idleness had to set in. Caused the temple to need to be repaired. Verse 19, a feast is made for laughter, and wine makes merry, but money answers everything. That money answers everything seems to be the attitude of the ruler, perhaps referring to the childish ruler, that the money answers everything. The problem that people and the focus that people put on riches and money, that it is the answer to everything. Feast is made for laughter, and wine makes merry. The wine there I don't believe is referring to intoxicating wine, but it's referring to feasting. The drink of the day was wine, the juice of the grape. And so he's just referring to this is the time of feasting. But money is the answer to everything, some think. Right. 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 18 is like drifting. You start, not paying attention to there's leaks in the building. You start not paying attention that the building needs to be repaired. And before you know it, it's going to be falling in on you. Right. Right. It's that attitude that of laziness and idleness. Well, what do we say? An idle mind is the devil's workshop. To get you to be lost and to get me to be lost, he doesn't have to get us to go out and kill and rob banks and, become criminals or anything like that. He needs us to become idle. For Satan to be successful in this congregation, he needs every member here to become idle. And when that happens, we start drifting. Start drifting. Look at verse 20. Do not curse the king even in your thought. Do not curse the rich even in your bedroom. For a bird of the air may carry your voice, and a bird in flight may tell the matter. Don't we have a saying, a little bird told me? This comes from this. In other words, that message has got out. And he's saying you need to be careful what you say because word can get back to the king. You need to be careful the words that you say because it will be passed on. Even if you don't intend it to be passed on. If you're even in your bedroom in a secret place, in a sense of privacy, if you're not careful what you say, it can be passed on. And so he's talking about how that rumors, things of that nature can cause problems. So as we've seen in chapter 10, we'll get into chapter 11 next week, we see the how that wisdom and foolishness is contrast. and how that a little bit of foolishness can do a whole lot of damage. A little bit of foolishness can do a whole lot. You know, in James chapter 3, James talks about how the tongue is a small member that can do so much damage, just like a little bit of fire from a match can destroy a whole forest. Just a little bit, because it spreads. And talks about the value of wisdom and doing what is wise in the eyes of the Lord. And we'll take up with chapter 11 next week, Lord willing.